Under the burning sun of a small frontier town, dust lifted from the ground like smoke from a forgotten prayer. The church stood at the end of the road, its wooden doors open wide, filled with the sound of music and murmured vows. Inside, candles flickered against the walls as townsfolk whispered blessings for a union that was supposed to be ordinary. But fate never asks for permission. It just arrives, sudden, loud, and unstoppable. That day it came in the form of a woman running barefoot down the street, her dress torn, her breath short, and fear shining in her eyes. She didn't look back, though she could still hear the echo of boots behind her. The man she had left her ex was shouting her name, but his voice faded as she burst through the church doors. The room fell silent. Every head turned as she stopped, panting, her hands trembling at her sides. A bride and groom stood frozen at the altar, confusion spreading through the crowd. She didn't mean to interrupt the wedding. She didn't mean to hide here. But when her eyes met the stranger standing at the front, something inside her stilled. He wasn't like the others. The man before her stood tall, his dark braids hanging down his chest, his features calm but unreadable. The air around him carried the quiet weight of the wild and tamed, ancient and proud. The whispers rippled through the church. "An Apache," someone muttered. He didn't move, only watched her with eyes that seemed to see beyond panic, beyond the noise. For a moment she forgot where she was. Her heart raced, but not just from running. The townspeople shifted uneasily. The preacher cleared his throat, unsure if this was still a holy gathering or the start of a scandal. Then the man she had been running from appeared at the doorway, his shadow cutting across the light. His voice was sharp, his words bitter. "You think you can hide from me here?" he growled, his hand twitching toward the revolver on his belt. The Apache stepped forward, calm as stone, his voice low and steady. "She is not yours." The words hung heavy in the air. The crowd gasped. The preacher hesitated, but the Apache didn't look away. The woman's breath caught. She hadn't come here for this. She hadn't planned any of it. But somehow, standing beside him, felt safer than she had ever felt before. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of rain and dust. The ex took another step forward, but the Apache didn't flinch. "You'll regret this," the man spat. "You don't belong here." The Apache's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Neither do you." The words struck like thunder. Something about his tone silenced everyone, his calmness, more powerful than any weapon. The preacher's hand shook slightly as he held the book tighter. "This is a house of God," he warned, his voice cracking. But even he knew this wasn't about faith. It was about fate. The woman turned to the Apache, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. The silence was thick. Outside, thunder rolled across the desert hills. He looked at her with steady eyes and said softly, "If you wish to be safe, stay." The crowd stirred in disbelief. The ex laughed coldly. "You think she'd stay with you? You're nothing but—" He didn't finish. The Apache moved faster than anyone could blink, his hand gripping the man's wrist before it reached his gun. The ex's cry filled the church. The Apache didn't hurt him. He just looked at him with a stare that could break a man without a single strike. The woman's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the wind outside slamming against the windows, the sound of the storm rising like something alive. When the Apache finally released the man, he stumbled backward, humiliated, and the whole room held its breath. The preacher looked at the Apache, then at the woman, and said the words that would change everything. "If she stays, must choose her place in front of God." Her hands trembled, her voice small but clear. "Then let me stay." No one spoke. The bride and groom who had been meant to marry that day quietly slipped out, the preacher's eyes wide with confusion. "You mean," he began. But she nodded before he could finish. "If I must marry to be safe," she whispered, her voice breaking, "then I'll marry him." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, disbelief. The ex shouted, but the preacher raised a hand for silence. The Apache didn't move. He looked at her as though time itself had stopped. Then, after a long pause, he said in a quiet tone, "You don't know what you are saying." Her eyes glistened with tears, but her resolve didn't waver. "I know what I'm running from," she said softly. "I know what I see when I look at you." The preacher hesitated, glancing toward the crowd. "This isn't proper," someone muttered. "It's madness," said another, but no one left. No one could look away. The Apache took one step closer to her, his expression unreadable. "You don't belong in my world," he said. She shook her head. "Maybe I never belonged in theirs." The candles flickered as the wind howled through the open doors. The preacher, trembling, finally began the vows, unsure if this was salvation or sin. The ex stood in the doorway, his face pale with fury. But no one stopped the words once they began. The Apache's deep voice echoed through the church when he finally spoke his vow, a promise that felt older than time itself. And as he took her hand, thunder cracked outside, shaking the windows. The townsfolk crossed themselves, some whispering prayers, others curses. The ex turned and stormed out into the rain, his anger swallowed by the wind. When it was done, the preacher closed the book, his hands trembling. "You are husband and wife," he said softly, as if the words themselves might wake something sleeping beneath the earth. The woman stood still, her heart still racing. The Apache didn't smile. He simply turned to her and said, "You don't have to be afraid anymore." But even as he said it, she knew the fear wasn't over. Outside, the storm raged like it had been waiting for this moment. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of horses echoed across the plains. She didn't know what kind of life awaited her now, or what it meant to belong to a man like him. But deep inside, something told her that this wasn't just the end of one story, it was the beginning of another, one that would test every truth she had ever known. As the church doors closed behind them, the candles flickered and went out, leaving only the echo of their footsteps and the whisper of the storm. Somewhere in that darkness, their fates were already written, two souls from different worlds, bound by a choice made in fear, but sealed by something far deeper. And though she didn't know it yet, the man she had just married carried secrets that would soon make her question everything she believed about love, loyalty, and freedom. The rain had not stopped since the moment they left the church. It came down in a steady curtain, soaking through her thin dress as she followed the Apache down the narrow dirt path leading out of town. The storm swallowed every sound except the low roll of thunder and the distant crack of branches. She wanted to ask where they were going, but the weight of everything that had just happened pressed against her chest. She had run into a stranger's wedding to escape her past and walked out a married woman. The thought made her shiver not from cold, but from disbelief. The Apache walked ahead, quiet and calm, as if the storm was nothing. His steps were sure, his presence steady. Every now and then he would glance back to see if she was still keeping up, his dark eyes reflecting the faint glow of lightning. When they finally reached the edge of town, he stopped and turned toward her. "You can go back if you wish," he said in a voice deep and calm. "No one will stop you now." She looked behind her. The town was a blur of dim lights and rain. Somewhere in there was the man she had spent years trying to forget. She shook her head slowly. "There's nothing for me there," she said softly. He nodded once and started walking again. They moved through the open plains, where the land stretched wide and endless. The rain had turned the earth into soft clay, and her shoes sank with each step. She stumbled once, and before she could fall, his hand caught her arm. It was a simple gesture, but something about his touch made her heart skip. He didn't say a word, only helped her find her footing again. As the hours passed, the storm faded into a mist. The land opened to a small ridge overlooking the valley below. There, hidden among the rocks, was a small cabin made of rough wood and stone. Smoke rose faintly from a chimney. It wasn't what she expected, a home built with quiet strength, surrounded by wilderness that stretched beyond the eye could see. "This is where I live," he said as he pushed open the door. The inside was simpler, fire pit in the center, a bed of furs in the corner, shelves lined with dried herbs and clay jars. The smell of smoke and rain filled the air. She hesitated at the door, unsure if she was intruding. He gestured toward the fire. "You are cold," he said. She obeyed without argument. The warmth of the fire slowly reached her skin, and for the first time since the church, she exhaled fully. He moved with quiet purpose, hanging his soaked coat near the flames and pouring water from a clay jug into a cup. When he handed it to her, she noticed the small scars along his hands' old marks, like stories carved into his skin. "Why did you help me?" she asked quietly. He sat across from her, his gaze steady, because no one else would have. There was no pride in his tone, no attempt to sound noble. It was just the truth. She looked down at her hands, thinking about how icily her life had turned upside down. The man she had once trusted had become her biggest fear. The people she had called friends turned their backs when rumors spread. And now, she sat in a stranger's cabin, married to a man whose name she didn't even know. "You don't have to stay," he said again after a long silence. "The marriage was only words. I said them to keep you safe." She lifted her head slowly. "And what if I want to stay?" He looked into the fire, the light flickering across his face. "Then you should know who I am," he said, "what you've done by choosing to be with me." He didn't say more after that. He arose and stepped outside into the pale night air. She sat alone, staring into the fire, her thoughts racing. The storm had passed, but her heart still felt caught in its center. Every question she had about him only deepened the silence between them. Who was he really? Why did the town whisper his name like a curse? When he came back, his hair was wet, tied back with a strip of leather. He handed her a blanket and said quietly, "Rest. Tomorrow, we will go into the valley." She lay near the fire, exhaustion finally pulling her under, but sleep didn't bring peace. She dreamed of the church, of faces staring, of the preacher's trembling hands and the echo of the vows that still lingered in her ears. And beneath it all, she kept hearing his voice, steady, and come telling her not to be afraid. Morning came pale and gray. Storm had cleared, leaving the earth damp and quiet. She woke to the smell of smoke and roasted corn. He was already up, crouched near the fire, his movements silent and focused. When he noticed she was awake, he handed her a small wooden bowl. "Eat," he said simply. She hesitated before taking it. "Still haven't told me your name?" she said softly. He glanced up, then looked away. "Names are not important where I come from," he said. "But if you must call me something, the people here know me as the Apache." "The Apache," she repeated, the words unfamiliar on her tongue. "And what should I be to you?" He looked at her then, really looked at her. "That is for you to decide." They left the cabin after sunrise, walking down the ridge into the valley. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of wet grass and wild sage. Birds moved through the tall trees, their wings flashing in the light. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt the world this quiet. Every step she took beside him made her wonder how someone so still could carry such presence. As they reached a stream, he stopped and crouched down, brushing his fingers through the water. "The land remembers everything," he said softly. "Every storm, every wound, every step that crosses it." She knelt beside him, watching his reflection in the water. "And what does it remember about you?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Too much. They spent the day gathering herbs and firewood. He taught her how to tell the safe plants from the dangerous ones, how to read the signs of rain by the shape of the clouds. His world was quiet, but not empty. It was filled with the hum of the earth, the whisper of leaves, the pulse of something eternal. She began to understand that his silence wasn't distance, it was discipline. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing where the wind moved through the grass like waves. He stopped suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "Someone was here," he murmured. She followed his gaze and saw faint hoofprints in the mud. Her stomach tightened. "Do you think it's him?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said finally, "but he will not come here alone." Fear flickered in her chest again. She hadn't thought about the man she'd run from since the wedding. But now the memory came rushing back, the way his voice had sounded, the way his eyes had burned with anger. She looked at the Apache, wondering if he regretted helping her. That night, they returned to the cabin. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. He kept glancing toward the horizon, his instincts sharp. She sat by the fire, clutching the blanket, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. "Why do they fear you?" she asked quietly. "In town they looked at you like you were a danger." He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "Because they do not understand me," he said. "Because they remember a war that ended long ago, but never ended inside them." She listened, her heart aching. "Do you hate them?" He shook his head. "Hate makes men blind. You see too much to hate." For the first time, she smiled faintly. There was something in his voice that calmed her even as danger crept closer. But somewhere outside, beyond the sound of the fire, a horse neighed in the dark. He heard it first, his hand going still, arose and moved to the door, listening. The world outside was quiet, too quiet. She stood behind him, her pulse quickening. "Is it him?" she whispered. He didn't turn. "Maybe," he said again. "But whoever it is, they are not lost." Lightning flashed far in the distance, illuminating the valley for a heartbeat. For that single moment, she thought she saw a figure on the ridge watching, waiting. The storm that had passed once was coming again, but this time it wasn't the weather. It was something darker, something human. And as the fire flickered between them, she realized that her escape wasn't over. It had only just begun. Night pressed in like a held breath. Apache stood with his palm on the doorframe, reading the dark as if it were a letter delivered by the wind. The woman waited behind him, her fingers tight around the edge of the blanket. Somewhere out on the ridge, a rider had paused to listen. The fire crackled. The horse gave one low answer to the night, then fell silent again. She felt the hush of the valley settle over the cabin, a hush that meant a choice would have to be made soon. By morning, the world seemed harmless again. Frost silvered the grass between the rocks. Apache led her out to the stream, where the water ran so clear she could see the tiny pebbles blinking in the current. He moved like he had grown from the earth, each step measured, each glance precise. She wanted to ask him again about the rider, but he only said, "Tracks fade in daylight." He showed her where to set snares, how to braid the thin willow cord, how to press the heel just so to leave no mark. She was learning the language of the land while the old town language still circled inside her, the talk of rings and rules in the narrow street where everyone knew your business before you did. When the sun rose high, he took her to a ledge that overlooked the whole valley. Far off, the railroad cut a black line through the hills, and a new ranch sat like a brand burned into the grass. "This is why they ride out here," he said, not pointing but watching. "New men bring new fences. Fences bring trouble." She thought of the ex and the way he had always hated the quiet, how he needed the saloons and the praise that came too easy. He had a way of finding men who wanted to flash metal and raise dust, who would not ride alone if he came. They headed back before noon and found a bundle hanging from the cabin door. It was a spit of yucca fiber and dried seed pods arranged carefully, like a knot that held meaning. The Apache took it down with care and studied the weave. "My mother's sister," he said. "She wants to see us." The woman blinked. "Us?" He nodded once. "Word travels faster than we do." They crossed the stream and followed a narrow deer path under cottonwoods. The trees gave way to a hidden meadow where smoke rose thin from a low fire. A woman sat near it, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes steady as rain. Two younger men stood just beyond, watching with patience that felt like another kind of gate. The Apache greeted the older woman first. No one rushed to speak. The woman who had fled the church stood with her hands still, aware of every thread on her dress. Then the elder woman stood and looked her over with something like pity and something like pride. "My sister's son made a storm inside the church," the elder said in a voice like flint striking steel. "The town will not forgive Isley. What do you bring to pay for that storm?" It was not a question about coins. The woman swallowed. "I can work," she said. "I can cook. I can learn. I can keep a place warm." The elder studied her, then turned to the Apache. "You have chosen a wide path," she said. "Wide paths look safe. They are not." They sat together beside the fire. The Apache translated what need be, though often the elder's eyes made words unnecessary. She set a pot to simmer and scattered dried leaves into the water. "There will be riders," the elder said. "The big ranch wants the creek. The town wants the story to end with a lesson they like. Your marriage gave them a new lesson they do not like." She stirred the pot once. "I will send a cousin to watch the ridge." Then she looked directly at the woman. "You must decide if you are only hiding or if you are staying. There is a difference." They parted before dusk. On the way back, the Apache spoke more than usual. "My father was a guide once," he said. "When the army moved through, he told them where the land would not kill them. They paid him until they did not need him. After that, people learned to look at us like smoke they wanted to wave away." The woman listened and felt how thin her own story sounded in the open air. "I left home with a man who promised a house and kindness," she said. "I got a room where the door closed too hard and the kindness came with a price. When I left him, I meant to be clean, or keep my head down, forget the sound of his boots. He did not want to be forgotten." The Apache nodded to the trail as if it understood. Forgetting is a gate he cannot open, he said. He will break the fence instead. Back in town, other stories were growing like weeds after rain. The preacher sat in the empty church and traced the grain in the pulpit with the back of his hand. The couple who had been pushed out of their own wedding sat in the front pew, faces hot with embarrassment. The groom spoke first. "You could have stopped it," he said. The preacher shook his head slowly. "This building is wood and nails," he said. "Stopping storms is not what it was made to do." Outside, voices rose and fell. Some folks wanted the sheriff to ride out and fetch the woman back, as if the law was a long net cast over private vows. Others whispered that the Apache had saved a life, and that should count for something. A storekeeper with bright cuffs and a dull heart complained about trade. A teacher whispered about dignity. A widow lit a candle and prayed for the woman, though no one saw her do it. The sheriff visited the big ranch that afternoon. The rancher had money and a map on his wall with red marks that crawled along the creek like fresh scars. He poured coffee, the way men pour favors, slow and controlling. "You let this go on," the rancher said. "Soon no one will trust the church, then they will not trust you." The sheriff took a slow sip and watched the map. "I enforce the law," he said. "Marriage is not against the law." The rancher smiled with only half his mouth. "There are other laws," he said, tapping the map, "like the law of a thirsty herd in a dry summer. That new cabin sits too close to water that is about to matter." The sheriff set the cup down. He knew a warning when he heard one dressed as a fact. The ex sat 2 doors down at the saloon, fingers drumming on his glass. He tried to laugh with men who liked loud stories, but his voice slipped out of rhythm. He watched the street like it owed him something. When a deputy walked by, the ex stood and caught his sleeve. "You hear what folks say?" he began. "She is not right in the head. That marriage is a stain. The church should be clean." The deputy looked at him long and then freed his arm. "What you want is not the same as what is right," he said. "Go home." The ex did not go home. At that night he saddled a horse behind the livery, then paused. Another man waited in the shadow. "You want the creek?" the ex said. "I want her. We do not have to like each other to ride the same trail." The man in the shadow stepped forward, a ranch hand with a scar that cut his smile into 2 uneven parts. "We ride at dawn," he said. Quiet. On the ridge, the Apache's cousin kept watch. He was younger, quicker to grin, quick too, with a hawk's call he used as a signal. Just before daybreak, he sent it slicing through the gray. The Apache heard it and answered with a whistle like wind under a door. He woke the woman and handed her a jacket. "Visitors," he said. "No noise." They took the long path down the back of the cabin and crossed the stream where the stones kept sound tight. In a grove of cottonwoods, he showed her a low hollow hidden by roots. "Stay here. If you hear the hawk twice, do not wait for me. Follow the water north." She wanted to argue. Her mouth opened and closed. Then she caught the look in his eyes. Not fear, not even worry, but a hard understanding that the day was a hinge. She lowered herself into the hollow and pulled leaves over the opening. He moved away like a shadow dismounting itself. 3 riders reached the cabin not long after. Cousin watched them from the rocks and kept his bow low. 1 rider stayed by the door, while 2 circled wide, looking for prints. The ex did not dismount. He just stared at the door with a grin that belonged to yesterday. Then the Apache appeared from the trees, not from the trail they expected. He did not go for his knife. He only placed his palm on the cabin wall like greeting an old friend. "You came early," he said. The ex laughed. "I like to be first." The ranch hand with the uneven smile lifted his chin toward the stream. "We need the creek," he said. "We can make this friendly, or we can make it long." The Apache looked past them to the ridge where the hawk call could be born any second. "The creek is a road that existed before your fence," he said. "It will exist after your fence falls." The ranch hand spat. "Words do not water cattle." The woman listened with her heart hammering inside the hollow. She could not see the riders, but the voices carried in short, clear pieces. She tried to breathe slow and real. Her hands found the small bone charm the elder had fixed to her belt that morning. A simple shape rubbed smooth by other fingers she did not know. She thought about the church and how the preacher's book had trembled. She thought about the vow that had come from a place in her she had not known she possessed. She pressed the charm to her palm and waited. The cousin's hawk cry came once, The Apache answered with the call of a sparrow. Then everything went quiet, the kind of quiet that means choices are walking toward you. The ranch hand slid from his saddle. The ex slid down too. "You send her out," the ex said. "We finished this story clean." The Apache stood easy. "This story was never clean," he said. The ranch hand's fingers touched the stock of his rifle. The Apache lifted one hand, palm open. "No," he said, and somehow the word filled the space like the walls of a barn. The cousin moved along the rocks with a patience that belonged to water-shaping stone. Inside the hollow, the woman could not sit any longer. She edged to the opening and slid into the grove, keeping low. From there, she could see the horses, the set of shoulders that always meant trouble, the stillness that meant the opposite. She took one slow step, then another. A dry twig snapped under her heel. The ex's head turned quick as a fox, catching a hen's breath. He took one step toward the grove. The Apache's hand closed slightly, the smallest warning. The cousin's arrow lifted, then settled again. No one breathed. Beyond the conflict near the cabin, other wheels turned. The preacher saddled his old mare and headed for the ridge with his hat pulled low. He told no one. He carried nothing but a Bible and the memory of a promise he had made to himself when he first put on the black coat. The sheriff rode a different way with his deputy, not toward the creek, but the ranch house. He had decided to count cattle and ask who had been sent riding at dawn. He was tired of being told after the fact what the law should mean. In town, the widow who had lit the candle went to the teacher's house and asked if someone would look after the small ones if the street went loud before noon. The teacher nodded and set out a tin of crackers. Quiet plans spread like water through cloth. Back at the grove, the ex spoke in a voice he had once used to lay honey over traps. "You are hiding in there," he said, not quite loud. "You think he can keep you safe forever?" He took another step, and the woman saw the familiar tilt of his head before the anger always came. She felt a strange strength rise in her, something that had been sleeping through too many wrong hours. She stepped out from the trees with her hands empty and her back straight. The ex stared, startled, as if he had expected a shadow and not a person. The ranch hand lifted his rifle a hair. The Apache did not move. "You do not speak for me," she said to the ex. He never did. Her voice did not shake. It surprised her. It surprised everyone. The ranch hand's eyes slid to the Apache, measuring what a sentence like that might cause. The ex forced a grin that looked like a cut. "You do not know where you stand," he said. "I know exactly where I stand," she answered. "I stand where the vow was spoken." She did not look at the Apache when she said it. She looked at the man who had followed her with a set of keys he thought would always open doors. The hawk cried twice from the ridge. The Apache's eyes flicked once in that direction. He gave the smallest shake of his head to the cousin, a sign to hold. The riders' horses stamped and tossed. Somewhere behind the grove, another set of hooves clicked on stone. For a heartbeat, the woman thought it was more ranch hands. Then she saw the elder step from the trees with two women at her side, each carrying a woven basket that could have held fruit but did not. The elder's face was calm as she walked between the horses, her gaze fixed on the Apache like they were finishing a conversation that had started before dawn. "You bring men to borrow water with fear," she said to the ranch hand. "Fear is the worst bucket. It leaks." The ranch hand opened his mouth and then closed it, thrown off balance by the presence of women who did not move like anyone's idea of a threat. X looked between. Faces searching for the old pattern where he could push and watch something fall. They did not find it. A new wind picked up from the north, carrying the far whistle of the railroad. The sound threaded through the valley and reminded everyone that the world was larger than this clearing. The sheriff's shape appeared on the long ridge, small against the sky, riding hard. The preacher's mare struggled up a hidden path, closer than anyone expected, the old book tied with leather to the saddle horn. The elder lifted the lid on one basket and drew out a piece of cloth painted with symbols that glowed in the dull light. She held it up so the Apache could see. His jaw tightened. The woman watched his face and knew in that instant that the secret he carried did not belong only to him. The cloth marked a debt, or a promise, or a grief with a name she could not read. The wind died as quickly as it had come. For a breath, the valley listened. Every person in the clearing felt how near the next moment stood, how thin the thread was that held words and guns and oaths in place. The sheriff lifted his hand on the ridge, a sign to wait. The ex shifted his weight toward the grove. The cousin's bow barely flexed. The Apache looked at the cloth, then at the woman, then at the creek that had been here before any of them. He set his feet as if he were stepping into a river that would carry him whether he wanted it to or not. No one spoke. The choice curled inside the silence like a fuse. The air was thick and restless, the kind of air that warned of change. Clouds began to gather above the ridge as if the sky itself could sense what was about to unfold. The Apache stood silent, still holding his gaze on the cloth in the elder's hands. The wind tugged at it, revealing faint red markings, symbols of debt and promise, written in a language the woman couldn't read but could somehow feel. The elder's expression didn't soften. "The land remembers old wrongs," she said, her voice steady. "And some of them have come walking back." The ranch hand shifted in his saddle, impatient. "Enough talk," he said. "You've had your say. Now the creek's ours, and so's whatever sits on it." He glanced at the woman, a thin smirk curling on his lips. Even that. The Apache's hand clenched slightly, but he didn't move. His eyes dark and still, locked on the man's with a calm that was almost terrifying. "You speak to Isley for someone who does not understand what he owns," he said. The ex laughed, bitter and hollow. "You talk like this land answers to ghosts, but it doesn't. It answers to men like me, the ones who can take it." He turned his eyes toward the woman, his smile sharp. "And I'll take her back too. You think a word in a church makes her yours? You think she belongs out here with you?" The woman's pulse thundered in her ears. Every word he spoke pushed at the wall of strength she had been building since that stormy night. But she didn't speak. She watched the Apache, his jaw tight, his chest steady end. She knew he was holding himself back for her sake, for the peace that was hanging by a thread. Then the sheriff's voice broke the silence. "Nobody's taking anything today." He rode closer, his hand near his holster but not on it. "You men need to turn around and ride home before this turns ugly." The ranch hand looked up at him, his face unreadable. "It's already ugly," he said, his voice flat. "You just don't see it yet." The elder lowered the cloth slowly and looked toward the creek. "The water runs red in my dream," she said quietly. "It warns before it takes." The Apache's cousin appeared on the ridge above, bow drawn, but lowered, waiting for a signal. The air seemed to hold its breath. The horses twitched, uneasy. The woman could feel the tension like a wire drawn too tight. Every man there knew one wrong move would snap it. The ex took a step forward, his hand sliding to his belt. The woman's breath caught. The Apache's eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But the ex's pride was louder than his fear. "You think you can scare me with that look?" he spat. "You don't belong here? You never will." And then thunder cracked not from the sky, but from the ridge. A single gunshot echoed through the valley. The horses reared, the women screamed, and the echo rolled across the plains like a wave. The bullet struck the ground near the Apache's feet, sending up dust and stone. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos. The ranch hand shouted orders. The cousin loosed an arrow that split the air, grazing a hat clean off a rider's head. The sheriff drew his revolver, shouting for peace that no one could hear. The Apache stepped forward into the open, his posture calm even as the storm of men erupted around him. The woman ducked behind a fallen log, her heart hammering. Through the smoke and dust, she saw the Apache standing his ground. His voice steady as he called to his cousin in their language. His calm wasn't weakness. It was something deeper, rooted like the earth beneath him. The ex, wild with fury, turned his gun toward the log where she hid. "Come out," he shouted. "You think hiding makes you safe?" She pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound. The Apache saw the movement, his body tensing. "Your fight is with me," he said, stepping between her and the gun. "Leave her." The ranch hand hesitated, his rifle aimed but shaking slightly. "You can't win this," he said. "Even if you survive today, the men from the ranch will come. They'll burn this valley clean." The Apache's reply was quiet. "Then they will learn what it costs to own something that was never theirs." The elder moved toward the creek, her steps deliberate. She knelt and dipped her hand into the water, murmuring words under her breath. The woman didn't understand the language, but she felt it like a prayer mixed with warning. The elder looked up, her eyes meeting the Apache's. "You cannot fight what you were born to carry," she said. "But you can choose how it ends." The rain began again, soft at first, then heavier. It pattered against the rifles, against the water, against the trembling earth. The sheriff shouted again, trying to break through the madness. "Drop your guns. Nobody dies today." But the ex only laughed. "Somebody already did," he said, raising his weapon. Before he could fire, the Apache lunged forward, the motion so swift it seemed unreal. He grabbed the ex's wrist, twisting it until the gun dropped to the mud. The two men locked in a struggle, the rain running down their faces, their feet sliding on the soaked ground. The woman stood frozen, unable to look away. The ranch hand shouted, raising his rifle again, but the cousin's arrow flew first, striking the weapon from his grasp. The man cursed, clutching his arm. The sheriff fired into the air, his voice raw. "Enough," he yelled. "Enough." The fight broke apart as quickly as it had begun. The ex staggered backward, clutching his wrist, rage burning in his eyes. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Every one of you." He turned, stumbling toward his horse. The rain poured harder, washing blood and mud together at his feet. The Apache stood, breathing hard, watching him ride off into the storm. The ranch hand followed, shouting something about orders and justice, but his words were lost to the thunder. The elder stayed kneeling by the creek, her hand still in the water. The woman finally found her voice. "It's over," she whispered. The Apache shook his head. "No," he said softly. "It's only beginning." The sheriff holstered his gun, his face heavy with the kind of worry that doesn't fade. "They'll come back," he said, "with more men, with more guns. You need to get her out of here." The Apache didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the horizon, where lightning danced behind the hills. "If I run," he said quietly, "they'll take everything left behind. If I stay, they'll come for me anyway." The elder stood and walked toward him. "The land is already chosen," she said. "You can't run from what's in your blood." The woman stepped closer, rain running down her face. "And I'll stay too," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The sheriff looked at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You don't know what you're saying. I'll burn this place to the ground." She looked up at the Apache, her eyes steady, then let them try. The Apache's hand brushed hers, just for a second, a small promise in the chaos. "If you stay," he said softly, "you must be ready for what's coming." By nightfall, the storm had passed, but the sky still churned with clouds. The valley was quiet again, too quiet. The creek ran dark and fast, swollen with rain. The cousin patrolled the ridge, watching for the faint glow of lanterns in the distance. The elder sat by the fire, her eyes closed, whispering to the wind as if speaking to someone unseen. Inside the cabin, the woman stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. Every rustle of the leaves made her flinch. She could feel the weight of the vow she had made, not just to a man, but to a life that no longer allowed turning back. The Apache sat near the fire, sharpening a blade, his movements slow and steady. "They'll come before dawn," he said without looking up. "The ranch won't wait." She turned toward him. "And if they do," he met her eyes, and in that moment she saw the storm still burning quietly inside him. "Then we fight," he said, "but not for the creek, and not for revenge. We fight for the right to live without asking permission." Outside, a wolf howled somewhere in the distance. The sound carried across the valley, raw and haunting. The woman shivered, her heart heavy with fear but anchored by something stronger. The Apache's shadow stretched long against the wall, his form steady as the flames flickered. The elder's voice came from the doorway, quiet but firm. "The land is listening tonight," she said. "It will remember what happens here." The woman glanced toward the window again. Far on the ridge, faint lights began to appear, lanterns moving in a line, growing brighter with every passing moment. Her breath caught. "They're coming," she whispered. The Apache rose slowly, his face calm, his eyes cold with purpose. He reached for his bow and stepped into the doorway, the firelight framing him in gold and shadow. The storm might have ended, but something far greater was about to begin. The air was alive again with that same heavy stillness, that waiting silence before the world breaks open. And as the first sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley, she knew the night would decide not just who lived, but what stories would be told when the dawn finally came. The night was alive with the sound of hooves pounding against the earth, a rhythm of approaching fate. The Apache stood in the doorway, his bow drawn, his body motionless but ready. The woman stood behind him, her breath shallow, her fingers clutching the edge of the wall. The fire inside the cabin flickered wildly as the wind pressed against the door, and for a moment the world felt suspended between silence and chaos. The elder moved to the center of the room, her eyes closed, murmuring low words that sounded like prayer and warning all at once. The first lanterns came into view on the ridgemen on horseback, rifles gleaming in the faint moonlight. Their voices carried down the hill, rough and eager. The Apache's cousin whistled from his post above the creek, a signal that the line of riders stretched farther than anyone expected. The Apache glanced toward the woman. "Stay inside," he said, "no matter what happens." She wanted to argue, to stand beside him, but his tone left no room for refusal. The riders reached the clearing and began to spread out. The sheriff rode at the front, shouting for them to hold, but they ignored him. The ex was among them, his hat pulled low, a gun gleaming at his hip. "You think you can hide behind your walls?" he shouted. "We'll burn your peace to ashes." The Apache stepped forward, the firelight behind him casting his shadow long across the ground. "You can take the land," he said. "Well, you will never understand it." The ex laughed, raising his gun. "Then we'll see who it remembers tomorrow." Before he could fire, lightning split the sky in a blinding flash, followed by thunder that shook the hills.
Ow.
The horses reared and screamed, the men cursing as rain poured from the clouds in heavy sheets. The Apache moved like part of the storm itself, his arrows cutting through the air faster than the men could reload. The sheriff tried again to call for peace, but his voice was drowned by gunfire. The woman watched from the window, every breath caught between fear and hope. She saw her husband, this man who had once been a stranger, fighting not for glory but for something deeper, something older. Every movement was deliberate, not driven by rage, but by resolve. He fought like a man who knew he had nothing to prove and everything to protect. When the gunfire finally stopped, the rain had turned the clearing to mud. The ranch hands were gone, some fled, others disarmed by their own fear. The ex was still there, standing near the creek, his gun empty, his face pale with disbelief. The Apache walked toward him slowly, his steps calm despite the chaos around them. "You could have left," he said quietly. "You could have found peace somewhere else." The ex's laugh came out bitter. "Peace is for the ones who win." The Apache stopped a few feet away, his eyes steady. "Peace is for the ones who choose it." He turned his back, walking toward the cabin. But the ex, shaking with anger, raised a hidden revolver. The woman screamed his name, the sound cutting through the rain. The Apache turned just as the shot rang out. The bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him backward. Before the ex could fire again, the sheriff stepped forward and struck the gun from his hand. The man fell to the ground, clutching his wrist, his pride broken. Sheriff looked down at him, his voice hard and tired. "You've done enough harm for a lifetime," he said. "It ends here." The Apache pressed his hand against his wound but stayed standing. The woman ran to him, her hands trembling as she touched his arm. "You're hurt," she whispered. He looked at her and shook his head. "It's nothing." She could see the pain in his eyes, but also something else, relief. The storm was easing. The thunder rolled away toward the distant hills. By morning, the sun rose over a valley that looked almost untouched, as if the land itself had decided to forgive what had happened. Smoke still curled from the wet earth, and the creek ran full and clear again. The sheriff and the elder spoke quietly near the water, their words carried away by the wind. The ex was gone, taken back to town in silence. The ranch hand who had followed him had fled into the hills. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the valley was still. The woman helped the Apache sit near the fire, his shoulder bandaged with a strip of clean cloth. He winced when he moved, but his eyes stayed on her. "You should go back," he said softly. "The town will forgive you faster than they will forgive me." She shook her head. "There's nothing there for me anymore. Everything I was is already gone." He looked into the fire for a long time before answering. "Then you'll have to learn what comes after," he said. In the days that followed, they worked quietly to rebuild what had been broken. The elder stayed for a while, helping tend to the wounded and teaching the woman how to read the signs of the wind and the river. The cousin patrolled the ridge, though no more riders came. The sheriff returned once to check on them and left without a word, his eyes tired but soft. He knew what justice looked like, and it wasn't always written in law. Each evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the woman would sit by the creek watching the water move over the stones. It reminded her of how life kept going, even after everything had been torn apart. The The Apache would join her, his presence quiet and grounding. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't need to. Silence between them had its own language now. Weeks turned into months. The town began to change its story. At first people whispered that she had been taken against her will, that the Apache had bewitched her somehow. But the preacher who had once trembled through their vows began to tell a different story. He told them of a woman who ran into a stranger's wedding to escape her past and found something she didn't expect. Not a fairy tale, not a miracle, just a truth that most hearts spend a lifetime searching for. One afternoon, the woman went back to town alone. The streets were quiet, the people watchful, but not hostile. She stopped outside the church, her hand resting on the worn wood of the door. Inside, she found the preacher sweeping the floor. When he saw her, he didn't speak at first. Then he nodded once and said, "You look different." "I feel different," she said. He smiled faintly. "Sometimes God's path doesn't start in the church," he said. "Sometimes it ends there." She didn't know how to answer, so she just thanked him and left. When she reached the edge of town, she turned back one last time. The church bell rang in the distance, soft and low, like an echo of another life. Back in the valley, the seasons shifted. Wildflowers spread across the hills, the air filled with the hum of bees and the scent of sage. The Apache's shoulder healed, though the scar remained a quiet reminder of everything they'd survived. The elder had gone to live with her people again, leaving behind a small carved figure of a hawk. "For when you need to remember what watches over you," she'd said. The woman placed the figure by the window where the light could touch it each morning. She had learned to ride, to mend, to listen to the wind before it spoke. She no longer flinched at thunder. She'd found a rhythm here, one that didn't ask her to forget the past, but to forgive it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she and the Apache stood at the edge of the ridge. Watching the light fade across the plains, the creek below caught the color of gold and fire, winding through the land like a living thread. She looked at him, her voice soft. "Do you think they'll ever stop coming?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed on the horizon. "They'll come," he said. "They'll find nothing here worth taking. The land belongs to those who listen, not to those who claim." She smiled faintly, her hand brushing his. "Then we'll keep listening." He turned to her, his expression calm but warm. "We'll keep standing," he said. The last of the lights slipped behind the hills, and the stars began to wake one by one. The wind carried the faint sound of the creek below, the same water that had once run red and now ran clear. In its reflection, they saw not just survival, but the beginning of something whole. That night, as the fire burned low and the valley grew quiet again, the woman finally understood what the elder had meant. The land did remember, but it also forgave. It had room for new stories, new lives, and second chances. And somewhere between the ashes of what was lost and the roots of what remained, two souls who had once been strangers found something neither had been looking for: peace. Carved out of struggle, standing proud under the endless American sky,